Hello and welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm your host, ILTV Executive Editor Maayan Hoffman. Hostage negotiations are at a standstill. Israel accepted the U.S. plan, but Hamas hasn't, at least not yet. And with U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff staying away, or at least for a few more days, real progress seems to be out of reach. So what does this deadlock mean for the nearly 60 hostages still trapped in Gaza? And if talks fail, is Israel really prepared to go back to war? Tonight, we break down the stalled negotiations, the risks of military escalation, and Israel's strategic options. Plus, shocking findings from the IDF's own investigation into the October 7th attack reveal failures that may have made Hamas's invasion easier. Were soldiers unknowingly giving away classified intel? And how did dozens of troops at Nahal Oz end up unarmed, so close to the Gaza border? Joining me are Professor Kobi Michael and Ambassador Jeremy Issacharoff, two experts who will help us make sense of all of this. Let's get started. So I want to start by this. Sources say that hostage negotiations are at a standstill. As we know, Israel accepted the U.S. plan, Hamas has not. Some reports are claiming that Hamas may still accept some altered version of the plan. But U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff has said it will be a few more days before he comes to the region, and that it is unclear what our next moves will be. So with that in mind, what does this really mean for the nearly 60 hostages, almost 24 who we think are still alive in Gaza? Professor Michael, maybe you can start with that.
Thank you. I think that it is pretty understood that all the efforts that are done, be it by Israel or by the mediator Witkoff, is eventually a sort of an extension of phase one of the original agreement, because it is understood that the gaps between Israel and Hamas regarding the end state of phase two are unbridgeable. Israel cannot tolerate the existence of Hamas as a sovereign power, military and governmental entity in the Gaza Strip at the end of phase two, and just the opposite is the purpose of Hamas, and therefore there are efforts to extend phase one. I believe that there is a probability and the feasibility that it will succeed, but in a very limited manner. Eventually, I don't believe that Hamas is willing to release all the hostages, alive and dead, but with their prices that Israel cannot accept. And therefore, I believe that sooner or later, and it might be sooner than later, we will find ourselves in the second round, the military round against Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
So, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, just last night, there was a threat by the Israeli officials saying that we would potentially be back at war if this doesn't go through, even within the next 10 days. So, I mean, is that something that will be any different than what we saw for 16 months? I mean, we've been fighting 16, 17 months in Gaza, and really, Hamas is still in power. I mean, Jeremy, are we going to do anything differently?
Well, I would hope so, because I think it's absolutely vital, and first and foremost, to get our prisoners and our hostages back home. We need to do everything we can to take this off the slate and for the country to begin to heal itself from this very traumatic episode. And I think, this whole talk of whether we should stop the war or not, I have no illusions that if all the hostages come home immediately and we stop the war, this doesn't mean that there's going to be peace between Israel and Hamas, between Israel and Gaza, and that the Gaza stop being a threat to Israel. We are a strong country. We can defend ourselves. We can find the right means to deal with this once, our hostages are out of the hands of the Hamas. And I think that any talk of resuming the hostilities has to ask the question, number one, does this make the return of the hostages sooner? Does this cost us another several tens or hundreds of soldiers killed in an ongoing battle? And is it also realistic? I think Israel, first of all, has to keep its eye on the ball, get the hostages released as soon as possible, bring all of them home and start a period of recovery, and also adopting a position regarding the day after that would rein in us in Gaza.
But Jeremy, I think we also have to ask beyond those three questions, is it effective? I mean, Professor Michael, maybe you can take this. It doesn't, again, it seems that despite all of the excellent efforts that we've made, and certainly on other fronts, maybe more successfully, when it comes to Gaza, we actually have not managed not only to not destroy Hamas, but really to be able to remove its ability to govern in any capacity.
Yes, you're right, but there are two main causes to the unsatisfying results of the 15 months of war. The first one and the most crucial one is Biden administration that actually tied at least one hand of Israel behind its back, and Israel couldn't do what it was supposed to do in order to dismantle Hamas and to destroy it. And the second reason is that we were witnessing very, very severe tensions and disagreements, and even more than that, between the military and the political echelons. And I think that in this regard, I think that it was a mistake of the entire security establishment, mainly the military, that rejected the idea of occupying the entire Gaza Strip and establishing a temporary military administration in order to prevent Hamas from reconstituting itself and from any access to the distribution and the supply of the humanitarian aid that was used by Hamas in order to fortify and to establish its control over the territory and the population. But I think that now we are in a different position with a different administration, with a different experience, and with a different military echelon. And I assume that even the relations between the political and the military echelons will be different. But I would like to add just one more sentence by saying that we have to understand that since the first beginning, the war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip was not limited only to the Gaza Strip or only to Hamas. Hamas is one component of a very broad axis or camp, which is the resistance axis led by Iran. And therefore, from the second day of the war, Israel was deeply involved in a multi-front war, a regional war. Now, if Israel will fail to realize, to implement its objectives with regard to the war against Hamas, which means that Hamas will not be there anymore as a sovereign power, we are going to face a very challenging threats in all the other fronts which are involved in this war. It will not be contained or it will not remain only in the Gaza Strip. And this is something that we must take into consideration as well. And talking about healing the Israeli society, there is no doubt that the hostages is a very deep and bleeding wound in the psyche of the Israeli society. But on the other hand, and at the very same time, the idea that Hamas will remain there in the Gaza Strip is also a bleeding wound that we have to.
So let me stop you. I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut you off. But, Jeremy, I want you to respond to this because what I'm hearing is that, yes, it is important that we get these hostages home. This is what I'm hearing from Professor Michael. But the reality is that our southern border is still not safe, and that if we don't make the southern border safe and we don't eradicate Hamas, then we actually will again face another multi-front war. Do you agree with that sentiment? Or should we right now, when we have the Witkoff plan on the table, push to get those hostages home?
First of all, yes. That's what we should do, and I would like to say that a lot of other people, I wasn't involved in the negotiations at all, so I'm looking at it from the side, but a lot of people have said that this hostage deal could have gone through in May of last year. And I think that's and this is one of the things that Defense Minister Gallant said when he resigned. He said that we could deal with any military implications with the release of the hostages. And I take that as being very accurate. And I would say that, you know, it's been shown to be very clear. I mean, through the sheer numbers, we have been able to release far more hostages through negotiations rather than through military force. And in fact, it's possible that the military force itself may have killed some of the hostages. So I think this is a very important point to clarify here. Regarding the issue of Iran, I want to say something that might be a bit controversial. October 7th was the worst national security disaster that I can remember in this country. But I would say now that Israel's strategic position in the region after 16 months of war has actually improved dramatically. Hamas has been severely weakened. It's not disappeared, but it's been severely weakened. Hezbollah has been severely weakened, and its leadership has been pretty much fragmented. The Syrian regime, with or without connection to this, has collapsed. The Assad regime has collapsed. The Iranians attacked Israel with two massive missile attacks. Both were foiled and rebuffed by Israeli and regional defense mechanism. And I think it's important to understand that we are in a position now where the strategic building blocks for Israel in the area have changed. And this is something we should think about very carefully. We're in a position of strength. A military theorist, Karl von Clausewitz, said there's a culminating point of victory. And getting back to Gaza, the more, taking his analogy, the more you use force, the more you diminish your own gains that you've already achieved. And I think Israel has actually done very well in the multi-front war. And we're in a better position than we were on October 7th. Our deterrence is in a better position. And this is what we should use to create a different diplomatic reality on the ground. And that's why I believe we have to end the war in Gaza, start to get out of that trauma, and start to think and devise a proper policy for the region as a whole, as well as for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
And piggybacking on that statement, Jeremy, and I want to just move over back to you, Professor Michael, before we turn to this investigation that came out. The diplomatic reality is key here. If we go back to war, can Israel manage that from an international perspective? I know we have the backing of Trump. He said, go, let all hell break loose, do what you need to do. But certainly the rest of the world is against us fighting in Gaza. So how do you respond to that? Professor Michael.
Before responding that, I would like to refer to very shortly to what Jeremy said, and I fully agree with him about the change in the strategic and regional position of Israel. And Israel, eventually after this war, has positioned itself as a very strong regional power. And if Israel is a very strong regional power, Israel has to behave as a very strong regional power. And first of all, vis-a-vis Hamas. Secondly, with regard to some remarks that were made by Minister Gallant, I remember some other comments that were made by him that were not necessarily connected to the reality, if remain politically correct. Now, with regard to your question, I would say that the most important thing, if we like it or dislike it, currently is the United States of America. Europe is not important, or at least much less important. I'm talking with regard to the Gaza Strip and the resumption of the war. And the UN is irrelevant in this regard. And therefore, I think that I assume that the international community, mainly the Europeans and the UN, will not like the resumption of the war, and they will condemn Israel. But the American administration is much more important in this regard. And once the state of Israel, the government, will decide to resume the war because there are no other options, I believe that the rest of the world will follow or will align itself with the Americans, and I believe that it will be a very short war. I mean, it will not be another 15 months.
So let me ask you this. I want to shift over to the reports that have come out over the last few days. The October 7th report by the IDF, a high-level report that really indicated that there were several challenges before, during, and after the events of October 7th. But one of the main ones, of course, was that we did not take the threat of Hamas seriously enough. We didn't believe that the terror organization would attack us. In addition to that, we found out that on Nahal Oz base, for example, that Hamas didn't even need intelligence, but in fact, our soldiers were so negligent in their social media posts and otherwise that they basically knew where they needed to attack, how, and the workings of the base. Jeremy, take us. I mean, I thought we are the strongest and most incredible army almost in the world. How is it that our soldiers would be leaking information that would feed Hamas's attack on October 7th?
Well, if I could, Maayan, I'd just like to go back to one of the previous points and say, let's not forget that there is going to be an important meeting in Washington, D.C. Between President Trump and the hostages have recently been released. And it's quite possible that I think that President Trump has been a very important force in trying to push through solutions to this. And it's quite possible that this meeting will have an effect and give new impetus to the talks, which is frankly situated in a very confusing situation between the first and second phase and between talks in Cairo. So I think this is one thing that we should keep an eye on.
Okay.
The second point I want to make is, look, it's quite possible that we will have to continue the war in Gaza, but I would do it having shown the world that we've done everything possible to avoid the continuation of the conflict and to get our hostages back. Our diplomatic situation in the world, and I've seen problems in diplomatic circles. I think our situation today has been absolutely has become very, very negative, very concerning to me, looking at things that we've done over the last 40 years in a very positive tone. So I think that what we need to do
Jeremy,
is
I want to cut you off because I do want to have time to be able to move forward. And I think that we've, kind of beaten this horse. I think we see the two perspectives, but jump to the October 7th report for me if you can.
Okay, but just one sentence to say that we need to have a diplomatic display that we're willing to get a solution before we go back to war. In terms of October 7th, there's, I don't think at this point, we're getting a lot of information from the inquiries of the IDF. And I think that clearly shows there was clearly a massive breakdown in all of our defensive mechanisms, in all of our early warnings. And I, for the life of me, cannot understand if there were already major discussions on the evening before October 7th and clear indications, whether it's the SIMs being turned on and other indications of a possible attack, even a small infiltration, why there were 4 or 6 Apache helicopters were not put on full alert in the air, and there would have been a much quicker response against any sort of incursion into Israel. So I think there's a lot of factors here, and that's frankly why we need a state commission of inquiry to investigate all of these different aspects, and not only the military aspects, not only the intelligence aspects, but also the political aspects as well.
And Professor Michael, can you take that question as well? Really looking at it from a security perspective, what does need to change to ensure that this cannot happen again?
I think that what the inquiries eventually show is that we faced, first of all, a historical problem. The problem did not begin on October 7th or a day before, okay? We are talking about problems that began and existed in the system long before October 7th and led us as a system to the October 7th or to the results of the October 7th. And I would say that there are 3 levels of problems. The first one is, I would say, operational problem, okay? That even without having an intelligence indication or early alert, the forces, the IDF forces along the border should have been prepared much better than they were actually. We have in the second level a problem of discipline among the IDF units, and by the way, we saw it even during the war itself. Too many problems of discipline or absence of discipline or weak discipline, broken discipline among the rows, among the troops. And the third level is the intelligence and the conceptual level, actually 2 distinguished levels with regard to the way that we perceived the situation, the reality, Hamas, and our underestimation with regard to the capacities of Hamas and their, I would say, the strength of their will and ideology and the way that they are able to translate their will and ideology to capacities. And I think that we will need a very long series of corrections and changes that must take place. But they will not be able to do that without, first of all, accomplishing the inquiries. I think that there is a sort of a trust crisis between the society and the IDF with regard to the inquiries themselves, and more than that, there is a crisis in the IDF itself between the operational level and the supreme command of the IDF. And in order to correct it, I think that some of the inquiries should be done once again by other people and by under different leadership, and we will have a long way to do in this regard.
For sure. And unfortunately, that is all of the time that we have this evening. I would love to keep the conversation going, but I do want to thank both of you, Ambassador Jeremy Issacharoff and Professor Kobi Michael, for being here this evening. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at iltv.tv. Thanks for watching Insider. Have a safe and pleasant evening.